Hello, welcome to Scary Thoughts, Horror, Philosophy, Culture. I'm Marc Kate.
And I'm Chad Lott.
This is episode 122. We're going to be talking about Alien3, the David Fincher film from 1992. You can email us at whattthe, WHATTHE, at scarythoughts.org. And do you have anything to plug?
I do not.
I do. I was recently-ish on an episode of Footage Foreplay, our friends at the Overlook Theater, Unnamed Footage Festival. I was on their podcast to discuss the film Paternoster and the Mission of Light, this indie horror film about a murderous cult. It was really fun to be on their podcast. I recommend it. I love those guys.
I was really proud of you to show up with something they hadn't seen, because that's fucking almost impossible to do.
They know everything.
Yeah, way to alpha them.
Yeah, I did it. And in this episode about Alien 3, we will be discussing...
We're going to be talking a lot about what went right and what went wrong with this film. And I think a lot of the conversation in the last few years has been what went wrong with it, because the story of what the studio did to David Fincher is so in the public conversation. But I think it may have actually muddled how this film actually operates.
Spoilers ahead. All right, then where do you want to start with this one?
Well, I have had the experience of realizing that I have been brainwashed by the masses. And I for a long time, for years, thought that I did not like Alien 3 and that it was the worst one ever and blah, 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 blah.
When was the last time you saw it?
So probably like the late 90s was the last time I saw it. And like the assembly cut, the pseudo-director's cut, we'll get into that later, why it's not a director's cut, but it had not existed. So I'd seen a theatrical release in the theater at its time and maybe once on VHS after that. And I rewatched it recently, and I watched the assembly cut, which is the longer version of it. And I really enjoyed it a lot more. Like, it has major problems that I agree with what people say, but as far as it being like total trash and shitty, like a lot of the horror podcast circuit sort of makes it out to be, I totally disagree. I also don't think it's a work of secret genius like some of the contrarians say, but I think that the things I like about it are quite strong, and I think the things that are bad about it are quite bad. But all in all, it was a really nice break from my news cycle mainlining.
Yeah, anything's got to be better than watching the news lately. I don't know that we necessarily spend a lot of time on this podcast talking about whether we like something, but yeah, I think it's worth digging into with this movie because it is such this, it's not polarizing, it's just unanimously derided for a lot of reasons. And I think that the production of it is more notorious than, like, people know more and speak more about what a shit show it was to make than about the film itself.
Yeah.
And there are two things that I think are very valid when criticizing this movie. One is, as you kind of mentioned, the problems are very serious. They're not the kind of like, well, every film, never mind cinema sins, every film's got problems. And of course this one does if you dissect it. This film has epic problems that are stupid and insurmountable.
Yeah.
And then the other thing, if I might really quick, is, and this is just a disagreement with you, I find this movie to be really unpleasant and joyless. And I don't mean that a movie should be joyful, and I don't mean that a movie should be pleasant. I just mean my experience of rewatching this movie was, I didn't feel like I was getting anything. There are some interesting set pieces. There's some strong performers. There's a couple of ideas that are in that mix somewhere. But I just found that this movie was really just not... I had a hard time connecting with anything about it.
Yeah.
Almost.
At the time, Siskel and Ebert called it nihilistic and cruel, which is usually, right, those are like
That's
our
right
adjectives, right? Yeah, that's our stuff. But I think at the time they meant something kind of entirely different. This movie, one of the things I really appreciate about it that I think is unappreciated generally is it does point out the cheeseball qualities of Aliens in a way that if you're really invested in that sort of stuff, like the cheesy happy ending, the restructuring of the nuclear family at the end, all blah, 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 all that stuff. This movie is explicitly anti-military in ways that Aliens clearly isn't. And I think that there was a lot of people, including people involved in the creation of the script and even the novelization, who were really mad that Newt and Hicks are killed off. And it doesn't mean anything. And if you have just watched Aliens and this, like we just did, that whole thing feels a lot heavier. But imagine it's been 5 years. You haven't seen Aliens in a while. And that happens. It almost doesn't mean anything. It's just like a flat feeling death at the very beginning. And then in the original theatrical release, it's given a lot more short shrift. The autopsy of Newt is pretty much not the same level. I mean, even in the longer version of it, it's still pretty, they took out a lot. But when they showed this original cut with all the hardcore gore in it, and originally, it was they described it as Hellraiser level. And I guess the autopsy was extremely graphic. And then you have
it's pretty brutal.
Yeah, you have the hero of the previous film, Hicks, the love interest, doesn't even get a chance to survive. And then the bishop thing is weird because he basically asks her to euthanize him later. So it is if you were invested in the success of the characters and rooted for them in the previous movie, it's sort of an out of order Empire Strikes Back situation where it's the happy ending happened in the middle and then you just get the bleak shit at the end. That's interesting. That's kind of to my taste, but I think that there was so much friction towards that idea that people really fought Fincher on all that stuff all the way. So instead of getting this sort of imagine A24 making this movie right now, with this script, it would probably be pretty great because maybe the studio would be out of the way of it or whatever. And the really nihilistic elements could be dialed up and that would be the point. Here they feel muddy.
Yeah, that's fair. Speaking of the killing off of Newt and Hicks, I'm not so worried about they did away with characters I was invested in. And I understand what you're saying about 7 years later, we might be less invested. But the fact is, we are building a mythology. Mm-hmm. I want to be clear. I am not in favor of fan servicing. I don't give a shit. But this feels imagine if you were watching a TV series and episode, let's say 8 comes on. The protagonist just walks on and goes oh yeah, so-and-so and so-and-so are dead. So anyway, blah, blah, blah. And you're wait, those characters are just now not in this show anymore? It's just terrible writing.
Well, but it can be awesome though, because that kind of happens in No Country for Old Men. And it's glorious.
But that's not lazy script writing. This was just an illustration, not of a contempt for fans, which again, I don't care, but a contempt for what it means to create a narrative. Mm-hmm. And we talked about this a bit on the Aliens episode, where there's something really bold about switching genres entirely between a first and a second in a mythology.
Yeah.
Where it's quite God, it's really noisy out there today. There's a lot of background noise. I apologize. Where it's quite audacious to make something so bold as to go from horror to action film, from movie to movie. But I think this isn't audacious. It's just lazy. It is hard to not think of the production hell behind this movie when thinking about Hicks and Newt being dead. It doesn't feel oh wow, what a bold choice. It just seems who the fuck decided that? Give me a break.
Yeah, it's so unsuccessful in other ways that it doesn't, even if it was a bold choice, right? For example, you could say something about David Fincher having sort of a long-term beef with the idea of the nuclear family. You see, Fight Club is an explicit rejection of it, and what happens in Seven is also that on film. I can't remember. There's something similar in Zodiac it's not coming to mind, but there's a bunch of that, and it's sort of, it definitely has a feel of cheap 90s industrial angst, in the way that a little bit later, especially post Tarantino and the indie film boom, everybody has to die at the end. That was such a thing in the late 90s. It feels sort of the front loaded version of that a little bit.
That's funny.
Yeah. There really was a lot of a lot going against this movie just before any camera ever even rolled. I mean, there was something like 10 different scripts, and they'd sunk, I think, about $13 million into developing them. And it has a little bit of like the Jodorowsky thing, where Jodorowsky's Dune thing, where some of those scripts went on to be other scripts, which I think is kind of interesting.
Yeah.
But I thought it'd be interesting to maybe like talk about, kind of start at even before the beginning, and if hit on the different versions if you're interested in that. I have some notes on them.
I feel like I've done nothing but inundate myself with the lore of who did what and when.
Yeah.
That I'm a little saturated, but go for it.
So if you are interested in this sort of thing, I'm just going to hit it really quick, but the YouTube channel Alien3, that guy only does this. So that's definitely if you're into like the lore stuff. But I think, just because I'm rereading a bunch of William Gibson stuff right now, I thought it would be worth talking about. William Gibson, I believe, has the original script, and he is a sci-fi writer who wrote Neuromancer and all that stuff. And he was so far ahead of everybody else at a time when sci-fi was sort of dull, and he invented pretty much everything that we think of as sci-fi. Like the whole idea of the Matrix comes from him. Like the entire genre of cyberpunk, he basically invented. And I think his prose is pretty incredible. I think his plotting can kind of fall apart a little bit, and people make a lot of noise about how great his script was. I don't think it's that great. I had the graphic novel version of it.
Okay.
I've listened to the an audio play version of it they make, and if you're really into Bishop and Hicks, they come back in that one. But one of the things about it is he started writing it before the end of the Cold War, and then the Cold War ended, and so a lot of the thematic elements of his script, which had this sort of like communist space people versus capitalist space people with bioengineered xenomorphs in the middle, it was like a really expensive version of it, and post Cold War it just kind of doesn't work anymore.
I question that.
It might, because we're sort of back, Russia's back, right? But at the time, blue jeans had conquered the Soviet Union.
All right.
Yeah. But sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No.
I sort of was anticipating what you're saying. But
yeah.
I've actually been looking around. I was like, is there a cosmonaut sci-fi out there? Like, I feel like there should be, like, in the way that Comrade Detective is like a fake Russian or Eastern Bloc TV show that's like very Soviet. I was like, there should be just like an alternate future space where like it's just Soviet rocketry in space, and like I think that would be really fun. Maybe then there was like a couple versions of the script that had this prison planet element, which was like I think really interesting as far as the setting goes. I like the idea of like prison dramas are always sort of compelling for some reason, and then I like monastic stories like In the Name of the Rose. I'm like personally kind of into that stuff, but the elements of that get repurposed into what you've seen in this script, but also becomes pitch black. And Chronicles of Riddick movie, which I did not enjoy, but some people seem to really fucking love. And then there's another script where the planet was like a wooden monastery planet, which seems pretty goofy. And just like a bunch of different crazy bad ideas. Like there's one where all the xenomorphs kind of like team up and Voltron together to make like a Godzilla xenomorph.
Like a king rat of...
Yeah, totally.
All right.
And now you're like, okay, maybe, but probably not. It would be stupid. But all these ideas, I was thinking about Eames' Power of 10. Do you know what I'm talking about? Eames' Power of 10?
I've seen it like 1,000 times.
Okay,
to the 10th.
Yeah. So if you're not familiar, the Eames people who made the chairs and all that shit, they made this movie, which you have probably seen in school, where... I
mean, you've seen those images in my bathroom, right?
Yeah.
They're basically illustrations of that movie.
Yeah. So it's a movie, and there's a book too of the coffee table book, but it starts at the molecular level, and the camera moves back, and it moves back, and now it's like the cellular level, and then it's the small animals, and then it basically goes all the way up to like a picnic table, all the way off into space. And so the idea is like there's this exponential movement of the camera outwards. And that's kind of what Alien to Aliens was. So you have one creature on a ship. Now you have a shitload of them, and you have machine guns. And I think what's sort of unsatisfactory about Alien 3 is it's violating that expectation that Eames' Power of 10 delivers. Like it's like, okay, we're back to one xenomorph. Like, that's kind of unsatisfying. And then even though it does pop out of the animal, it sort of doesn't make any sense. Like, why is there some sort of epigenetic trigger that now all of a sudden it runs around? And, depending on what version you watched, it either comes out of an ox, which I think is cooler because of its biblical symbolism, or out of a dog, which explains why it runs around like a stupid dog. But yeah, I think that there's something about that that's not fun.
I think, and I recognize that this is just more about my taste, is that 1 and 2, and to some degree the other ones, I haven't seen, what's the newest one called? Good God, Mark.
Prometheosaurus.
Romulus
is what I'm talking about, yeah.
I haven't seen it yet. But
Same.
All of them until then, how do I put this? Work in these abstract absolutes. It's almost like the first one is sort of just, even though it's about, as we discussed, these workers on this shipping vessel, this mining transport, it's actually this really vague non-space where it's just in space.
Mm-hmm.
The second one, the background is just a desolate wasteland and a bunch of soldiers.
Mm-hmm.
Then 3 is about a bunch of prisoners. It just gets really specific.
Mm-hmm.
And then it goes, I think that it completely goes off the rails when it becomes religious and spiritual and completely mythological and tries to encapsulate all life in the universe. But at least there's something satisfying about how open and general and expansive.
Mm-hmm.
3, it might as well have been about a pizza restaurant.
Yeah, it's like...
Or something. Like, all of the other films are so expansive or absolute.
Yeah.
There's almost like a contextual minimalism happening, where context is so vaporous or something. Words are escaping me for this. But this one is just about a bunch of guys with Y chromosomes who stayed behind in a prison. Like, it's just so narrow, and it just takes the expansiveness of the potential of this world building, and it just drops away.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned the sort of like mythical and spiritual elements of the later films, because I think that, that's totally Powers of 10. It's like, it's doing like the Marvel Universe thing where, Iron Man starts in a cave, and at the very end it's like a totally cosmic universe where there's like gods from different places. And I just read this like 500-page book about the MCU and like the making of all those movies, and this franchise doesn't have an entire like army of people thinking about the coherence of it that the MCU does. And
right.
And that works for it and against it sometimes. Like, in Avengers Endgame, for example, the end battle is undeniably kind of badass. As much as I want to hate on all the things that happen.
Is it?
Yeah, man. Like, if you saw it in the theater, it might not work on you, right? Like, on a personal level. But I saw it in the theater, and like when fucking Captain America picks up the hammer, people went ape shit, and to me that's like a visceral, like, it's like if you're at a comedy club and everybody laughs, like the joke was probably funny even if you don't think it's that funny.
All right.
I also think I've in anticipation for this deep dive into Cormac McCarthy I'm going back into next year, I'm like reading the King James Bible, because it's like a foundational piece of literature basically for all of McCarthy's work, but it also does open up a bunch of sort of like Western mythology stuff for you. And one of the things is I started reading like books by monks about exorcisms, which I find really interesting, because I have the same experience with UFOs, whereas like the more I read about exorcisms, the less I believe in them. Not that I even started believing, but to me, it seems so hokey and fucking stupid. And the only time it's ever been cool is in The Exorcist.
Isn't that amazing?
Yeah. And then, but one of the things that's so interesting about The Exorcist is, and it's something I think that could have made Alien 3 better, is the faith of the priests is treated as factually as it possibly could be. And when faced with this insurmountable demon, this dragon, basically, if you're into the Old Testament, the old serpent, it's like the hardcore faith of the priest sort of functions as the only thing that stops it. And I think it would have been interesting if instead of Fincher creating this sort of like goofy fake future version of that, like what if they were just really hardcore Catholic priests and they had to confront this thing that's not part of their theology? Like how do they deal with it? Like, because one of the things I think that's cool about these characters, other than the fact I think the acting almost across the board is great in this movie. Like the prisoners, I think, are really good. Like
it's hard. I quite agree, but I think some of the writing is so bad that it undercuts the potential of these actors. Also, I know this is a really basic criticism of this movie, but they're all kind of dressed the same and they all have shaved heads and they're all angry and saying fuck all the time. So even though there are a lot of good performers, most of the dialogue is quite flat and uninteresting, and they're all kind of one character.
Yeah, kind of.
It's just that one is kind of the boss and one they're all mean to. And other than that, the fact that they're strong actors helps them to stand out, but it doesn't make them memorable, particularly memorable.
Yeah, I know what you're saying. Like, there's a scene like the part when like the fire bombing, basically, you know, they're setting everything on fire to force the xenomorph into like, this is slightly different in the different versions, but there's a scene where a bunch of shit catches on fire, a bunch of people die all at once. It's almost impossible to tell who has made it and who hasn't.
Completely.
Because there's not only are they basically in a uniform, they're all covered in so much shit. It's sort of like hard to even tell who's who in the different scenes. But
which might be fine. But it's sort of another layer of the wash. I think this applies to the set too. It's often leveled against this movie. Well, where are we? Where are they? We're always, we don't quite know where we are. And I think that's fine. I mean, that can be used to great effect. Oftentimes in cinema is a discontinuity of space or something like that.
The film doesn't commit to that though. And I think that might be...
That's what I mean.
Like, so I think that might be a consequence of the editing, because in the extended version, you get this really beautiful opening shot of like where her ship crash lands. And it looks like Oakland. You know, it's all these like cranes on the edge of the wasteland. Now, having lived in West Oakland, I kind of appreciate it a lot more than I did at the time, because I'm like, oh, that's what that would have looked like. But you don't spend any time outside. Like even in Hadley's Hope, there's like a little bit of moving around outside in Aliens. But this, it gets cut out. I've heard it described that they just cut all that shit out because once you're inside the place, it sort of doesn't matter. In Alien, you like the entire first 10 minutes of the movie is tracking shots orienting you where you are in the ship. And you know who does something similar is James Wan does the same thing in The Conjuring. Yep. You know, you get this like tracking shots to sort of like show you
we talked about that about Malignant as well.
Yeah, it does the same thing where it's like, because part of the deal is the space. And I think you had like there could have been totally the opportunity here to make that a thing. And I think that there are elements that get cut out. In the extended version, there's a scene where Gallic punches out a cigarette machine. He's like, oh, cigarettes. And it's like almost like in a video game that they found some loot and they like hit the button and it comes out. And to me, that's a kind of a really interesting and unexplored, potentially cool thing. It's like, oh, this place is so huge and fucked up and there's so few of them that they're still finding stuff. Like they don't actually know where they are. And they're using like candles as bread trails and things like that. And they talk about it for a second when Ripley's kind of like, okay, this is just, standard issue air ducts. Let's find out where the air ducts are and chase this motherfucker away. It worked last time. And they're like, it's impossible. There's a million of these. Yeah. And that's kind of it. And I think there are moments when like the characters freak out in a way that I'm like, oh, this is totally H.P. Lovecraft style shit. Like it's great. They just like lose sanity. And I think it would have been interesting if they're like, no one ever gets lost. Right? You have this giant crazy maze. It feels impossible to move around and everybody just finds each other all the time and all their plans work. Like imagine Ripley just lost in the darkness and sort of, what is that book? House of Leaves. Like a very House of Leaves element to this would have been so badass, but it doesn't have it.
Nope.
Yeah.
Yeah. The fact that it all looks the same could have worked in its favor. Instead, it is quite boring. The fact that all of the actors look exactly the same could work in its favor. Instead, it's quite boring. And that's kind of getting back to what I was saying at the beginning. Like,
this movie
film
like
is kind of unpleasant.
It gets you like almost, because there's even a scene in the extended version where Ripley she enters into like a cavernous. It's like when she's decided that she's going to go look for the thing because she realizes that she's carrying the queen. How does she realize that? Who fucking knows, right? But she goes in, and the set design has made it look like the xenomorph has started to turn it into the weird biological thing. There's like some spider webs here and there, and then she hallucinates the creature, and she like hits a pipe that she thinks is his head, and then a bunch of cockroaches come out or whatever.
Yes,
that is like borderline Event Horizon, and I think that is kind of neat. And then it sort of has this idea of the industrial cathedral space is its own horror element, and that, it gets into almost Eraserhead territory, and then it just doesn't do anything with it.
Yeah, that's fair.
Yeah. I think like if you're in the right mind, you can really use your imagination of what could have been and like really elevate this movie in your own mind, which is clearly what I've done. Because I mean, I get it. It's not that great, but like there's so much I appreciated about it this time around.
What else did you appreciate about it?
I actually really love the costuming, which is funny because the costume director, I think, was like the first person to quit on Fincher. He was like, he just said, "This guy's a total cunt. Fuck this guy."
Yeah.
And this kind of segues us into something I noticed where I think this movie is really influential on Kanye West's fashion, because I was like, when have I seen this sort of like baggy pants tucked into shrimp boots with a flight jacket sort of aesthetic recently? I was like, oh, and I went and looked, and sure enough, man, it's as if Kanye West completely stole the look of The Prisoners for some of his fashion lines. Yeah, and then I was like, man, there's a really extensive Reddit that shows every single movie that Kanye West has mentioned in every single one of his songs, and somebody did like a PhD thesis level work on this. Unfortunately, he does not mention any of the Alien franchise, but I feel like it might have been influential because the Yeezy Runners, are you familiar with those?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. They look like H.R. Giger
100%.
Birkenstocks.
Yeah.
There's that. And then his most recent thing with the metal teeth. I know that the Jaws from James Bond inspired the metal teeth for the xenomorphs. And to me, there's sort of like a continuity between that and Kanye West's crazy mouth thing going on. And then, this horror fan lady that listens to the show, Kat, her handles Up the Luddites. She mentioned something I didn't even notice in a message, that Kanye West's like pink shirt fashion style, it's not really preppy. It's actually from Kira, which is, from preppy originally. But like, I thought it was interesting that he's using specific looks from films to do that. So the fashion is something I liked about it. I like the color of the film, like the browns and greens, the very Finchery. I think that is pretty great.
Yeah.
And then like, I think Sigourney Weaver is the best Ripley in this one. I think her just acting is better.
Yeah.
And the one scene, the really most iconic Alien scene of her bald head and the alien like drooling on her.
Yeah.
She sells it so fucking hard.
True.
So there's that. I think Hutton, the guy that plays the main priest dude, the guy with the glasses, I think he's quite good. He was a convict, so he brings a little bit of the Al Matthews that played Apone?
Yes.
Yeah. So Al Matthews was a sergeant, so he sort of makes it. I feel like he adds a lot, and he's an actor who's like so good with his voice, like where he can use like the timbre of his voice to sort of change the weight and meaning of things. Because in the early part of the movie, he calls her, it's like, "Hey, sister," and it's like sort of insulting in the way that in the 70s you might call somebody your sister, but later he adds like weight to it. He's like, "Sister," and it's like she's part of their brotherhood, which I think is kind of a cool little thing that happens. But yeah, it's a lot of tonal stuff I like in the movie. I tell you what I don't like: the fucking alien in this movie is dog shit.
Yep.
Yeah. What did you like about it? Like, is there elements that you enjoy?
There's something about, okay, I'm about to completely do a 180. So just, hang with me for a moment. The idea of a prison planet of a bunch of prisoners who form a monastery rather than be relocated, I think is fascinating.
Yeah.
I think it is a terrible framing for this movie and for what this mythology can present. But I think there's something really interesting about prisoners are forced to confront their actions, whether it's a punishment or it's a rehabilitation. And so to have this mini society, I mean, there's nothing more monastic than being on a planet where some ship comes along, drops a bunch of food, and then takes off,
Yeah,
right?
totally.
There's something really interesting about a group of men deciding that they are taking the vow
Yeah, totally.
as prisoners to continue their work. I think there could have been more there. It seems that their code is just that they're prisoners. They're kind of a religious order and they don't take the Lord's name in vain or something.
Yeah.
But there's not much more there. Also, and I'm not the first one to point this out, but they're so mad that there's a woman there. You know, they're murderers and rapists and she's tempting them. Well, aren't they tempted to murder and rape each other? Like what?
Yeah.
Are they generally all really well behaved and she's really the chaos that's entered into the system? Maybe it is. I don't want to be too dismissive, but it would be really interesting if there were heavy lifting and good writing to articulate how it is they're able to be the worst of the worst of the worst, and they're able to just kind of hang out and work together based on their own good morals without a control system, like possibly better than the people in this neighborhood.
Yeah, it's like, it's funny, like the character Gallic, you know, who's sort of like the chaos agent of this movie.
Yeah.
And I thought it was interesting.
Who goes really extreme in the Ox version, right?
Yeah. So we haven't even talked about it. If you're listening to this episode, you're probably not a casual fan, but just in case you are, there are two major versions of this. There's a theatrical cut, which David Fincher did not edit the end version of it. And in that version, the xenomorph the facehugger attaches itself to a dog. And so the xenomorph is a canine xenomorph and it runs around like that. And there's even like some shots online where they attempted to put a costume on a Doberman and have it run around. And
I think it was a Whippet.
A Whippet. Yeah, it's a Whippet. It is fucking comically terrible.
I love it though.
Yeah,
I do love it.
Man, I wonder if anybody at Fox, I don't care. Do we mention the ILM thing?
Not yet.
Yeah. So like Fox had the opportunity to work with Industrial Light and Magic. And this is like Industrial Light and Magic that was making Jurassic Park at the time. So this alien could have looked great. And this is another, you know, in Eames Power 10 reference is like if you went back down below, like if you went off and suddenly the photography was something you had seen before and it was also a shittier version of it, you would be really displeased. And like the xenomorph just looks bad throughout all this. And a lot of people sort of say, oh, the CGI was terrible. But we were talking about how it's mostly a puppet in front of blue screen. And the CGI element isn't absolutely terrible. It's near the end. But this is just old fashioned shitty special effects.
Yeah. I love that. I think it was last episode you were bringing up Fox as the villain here. And it's almost like, I know this all happened a long time ago, but like, oh, you ain't seen nothing yet. You think Fox is the villain? Check this shit out.
I mean, really and it's just weird things like they did the right thing and gave Sigourney Weaver $5 million in a back end on this. And this movie didn't like fail at the box office. It you know, did a little bit better than break even. But I mean, you have two massively successful movies that were completely dependent on groundbreaking special effects. You think you would spring for some groundbreaking special effects on the third movie.
And also a deep investment in supporting a strong creative vision.
Totally.
Whether Giger's or
James Cameron
or Ridley Scott's
Yeah.
or etc. And this one, they seem to trust nobody for more than 5 minutes, to the degree that like one of the screenwriters who he's not as famous, so I'm forgetting his name. Apologies, dude. He had an assistant, and this assistant was like sharing pages and telling Fox everything that he was doing so that they could be one step ahead of undermining his plans for the screenplay. Just as an aside, I actually spent some time trying to find out who that was. This like tall, hot woman assistant, and she was like really smart and like overqualified to just be like a screenplay assistant. And she completely fucked him over and turned out to be a spy. I was like, who is that?
Yeah.
Who is that person? What happened to her? I can't find out.
That would be an interesting like Netflix drama.
Totally.
You know, like
it's like Breaking Bad, but it's
it's kind of like
Hollywood.
it's kind of like just how Hollywood works. Like, I mean, it's really similar to the story of the MCU, right? Like Iron Man, so much of the decision making of what we saw on screen and on film was just lawyers arguing about what movie Spider-Man could be in. You know, like, and a lot of the history is just like time wasted by suits and lawyers. Like, because the Spider-Man that Sam Raimi made was originally going to be James Cameron with Leonardo DiCaprio as Spider-Man and Schwarzenegger as Doc Ock. And that movie would have crushed because the special effects were kind of good enough at the time. And they just argued about like dumb, like it was just stuck in Lawyerville. And, you know, Cameron's like, well, fuck this. I'm going to go make Titanic. You know, and you're like, you see how that went.
Yeah.
You know, what a flop.
Yeah.
But the whole MCU movie is like that. And the whole MCU like process was like that. And it was like, you had like the first few films were quite wild and improvisational. And the way they were made was like really super loose. And it crushed. It obviously crushed. And then as it went on, there's just this like obsession over return on investment. And, you know, they want it to be the same thing, but more money coming back. It's like this like natural tension, like wasps and ants or something like that, like Suits and creatives. And then the best movies are clearly the ones that like took the most chances. I mean, even in the MCU, like Guardians of the Galaxy series, I think is the best of the whole thing. And they were pretty much left alone because like people are like, who are these fucking characters? Nobody cares. Whatever. You know, this is just another excuse to put Iron Man on screen. And I think that certainly seems to have happened at this point with Fox, but it's like people don't, even to this day, don't seem to learn that lesson. Yeah. But then again, there's like so much money involved, you know, and David Fincher, what did he do before this? Directed Madonna's Vogue, you know, so.
Yeah, but that's one of the most iconic videos in the history of pop music, so.
Yeah. I wonder, I mean, there must be, you know, I think we certainly probably have a survivor bias situation here, but there must be like so many movies where they just cut auteurs a bunch of money loose and then they produced like a steaming turd. I mean, like a great example, Boondock Saints. Like that guy, the guy who wrote it and directed is this bartender who just wowed everybody with his like boondockiness or whatever. And even to the part where he negotiated that they had to buy the bar he worked in for him to like work on the script. And they just gave him a bunch of money, and the movie is like, it has a certain charm or whatever, but
I hate it so much.
There's things about it. I think the dude that plays Daryl Dixon is fun in it. Like I like what's the Willem Dafoe. I think he is both extremely cringy as a gay person, but I think if they had just made him not explicitly gay, the character would have been better. Like there's a scene where he's like calls his lover a slur. And it's just so, if he had just been like, is this a gay dude? Like, it would have been a lot better.
Right.
But I don't think that Boston meathead that wrote the thing was capable of that sort of nuance.
Yeah.
But that's an example of like, that dude's technically an auteur because they let him do whatever the fuck he wanted and they gave him an enormous amount of money and it did not work out.
Yeah.
There must be others. I'm sure people will tell us.
I'm sure it happens constantly. It just strikes me as being about ego, that if you're running a company that makes movies and you have the money, you believe you have the control and the vision, and you're going to control your money. Imagine how much trust you would have to give someone, like, just think of all the money you have.
Yeah.
And you're going to give it to an artist, because you're investing in their vision and you're watching them work and you're like, I don't see what they're doing. I don't get that. This seems like they are setting fire to my money. It seems like they're going to want more. They're wasting a lot of time.
Yeah.
This looks like terrible cinema to me. I can understand wanting to interfere. The level at which Fox seems to do this habitually is baffling.
Yeah.
And it happens in the music industry as well.
Oh, I'm sure.
It's fucking everywhere.
I was thinking about like the level of micromanaging that must have happened in this movie, just from one story, which is the most famous shot from this movie and arguably the whole series, the xenomorph that like drooling on her bald head. They were like, you don't have time to shoot this. You have to go keep fucking with this puppet over here and get these puppet shots because those are action shots and that's where the money is. And he basically like disobeyed them, and they kind of like fired him for a minute because of it. And he went with like the skeleton crew and shot that scene, and it crushes, But it's crazy to me though, like, there are not other people around that go, oh, that's pretty good. Like even my job, like I'm as a creative director in an insurance company, which is not even remotely on the same planet as making something like a movie. We certainly are like lorded over by suits who want things a certain way, and we have performance metrics and stuff like that. But there's enough taste in the group to sort of sway people when you really want to. And I think that these like Hollywood types just must be a different breed. Like I've heard Joe Rogan talk about how some of these guys he thinks just have a borderline sexual fetish for controlling artist people. Like they just get off on it, like making it like their own way. And like Kevin Smith's whole story about writing the script for Superman is such a perfect example of it, because there's this producer who's like super coked up that keeps giving him all these fucking horrible suggestions. And these horrible suggestions end up in all the movies that the same creep makes,
giant mechanical spider.
Yeah, like he's like gets coked up, watches a movie about like a documentary about spiders, and was like, you need to have a mechanical spider, and it appears in Wild Wild West after. I mean, it's just like so fucking funny. I was trying to get away from like lore, in general, like this sort of like IMDb trivia stuff, but I realized I actually do quite love it, almost from like an anthropological. Sure. I like Hollywood is. And in some ways, I think, or movies, as we think of them, as like going to the movies, is an American art form. Like I know there's like the Tati and the French people and all that shit, but like that's not what we're talking about here.
Nope.
It happens in this environment of wild, fucked up people, and I don't know. I also wonder, like maybe having the suits around, like it's an antibody or something. Like maybe you need it. It's like the irritation and that makes the pearl and the oyster.
It's so hard to say. I feel like this is tapping into a conversation you and I have had since it may have been in our first episode. I don't know. But just about like artists veer anti-capitalist. Name me 10 amazing artists who are going to vote Republican in this next election. Like there is this tendency for creative people to have this very...
John Milius.
There's only like it's like it's just this way. Artists tend to want as much of their own version of freedom and restraint, but so much art, and especially cinema, is completely dependent on capital and capitalism. And if you're an artist that garners a lot of money, you can have illusions that you are the one who's in control of that money, but you're not. You're connected to it, but you're not actually. It's not how capitalism works.
Yeah, you're the director in Mulholland Drive, and somebody tells you that's the girl. That's what the reality is when you're like the auteur.
It's just an interesting part of art, and it's just so plain in Hollywood cinema, the antagonism between capitalism and creativity.
Yeah.
And I feel like there's just no working it out. We've talked about that outside of, let's say, cinema. Let's talk about like music that is not necessarily commercial music, like rock and pop or techno or something, or dance, or so much performance. The artists who create it spend a lot of time asking for money.
Yeah.
Because it's not necessarily sustainable on its own. Cinema does.
Yeah.
But what ends up happening is a film director, unless you're going to crowdsource or something like that, cinema directors above a certain price point don't have to go and like beg the Zellerbach Foundation for funding, at least in America. In other countries, there are government institutions that support their native cinema.
That's why we don't know any of those movies.
Well, you brought up Jacques Tati.
I know.
But they don't have to beg government institutions and publicly funded institutions. They have to beg people with lots of money, individuals in the Hollywood system.
Film's just like uniquely capital intensive.
Yeah.
You know, it's just like, I mean, you got to pay the food truck guy fucking $4 million on it. You know, there's just stuff like that. I love reading like those 50s and 60s like Hollywood books that like, you know, Stuntman, for example, I really loved all the stuff like that Tarantino talks about, because you're like, oh, this is like the formation of this industry town. And, you know, and yet you should have your hand out for your thing. If you're the guy that like trains horses, you want a fuck ton of money to train horses, you know, and even though you might have just been making like dirt wages in Texas being a cowboy, like now you're in Hollywood, so there's big money.
Yeah.
And I think, I don't know, like, you know, the part of my brain that's very interested in merit thinks, yeah, these people are the height of this. They should make the most money. Like the person who makes the fastest racehorse should get $1 million for a drop of that horse's jizz, you know, or whatever. It's like not some glue factory horse. Like, what are we talking about here? You know, there are things that are better, but it's interesting that, like, if you look at F1, like Formula One racing, those cars aren't getting any slower. Like, there's never a year where the car is like worse than the car 10 years ago, you know? But in Hollywood, you will have a movie that is fucking worse than the thing from 10 years ago. I mean, just the special effects in Alien 3 versus Aliens, it's such a significant downgrade. It's just strange that it wasn't able to maintain it.
Yeah, for sure.
But, you know, it's just artisans. Like, I mean, people forget how to paint in perspective at different points in history, you know? So maybe people don't remember how to make a convincing xenomorph in 7 years. Here's a side question. What did you think about the character 85? I think he has the best line in the entire franchise.
Which is what?
So I don't know if it's in the regular version, but Ripley, they're discussing the monks. And so he and the supervisor are, they're not, he's a company man. He even says as much. He's like, look, I'm a company man. You know, I have a wife, I have a kid. I'm just here. This is my job. It's a shitty job, but I'm doing my job. And all the people in all the monks sort of like lorded over him that he has an IQ of 85.
Yeah.
And he has this line where she's like, where he's kind of shitting on their religion, you know, which is funny because he's so dumb. You would think like a dumb person would be more likely to believe or whatever, you know, like, I don't traffic in that sort of argument that you're religious. Hollywood does though. Right. So this is kind of what I'm getting at is she says, you're not the religious type, are you? And he says, shit, no, I've got a job. I think it's the best line in the whole franchise. Like, and the way he delivers it is just like, it's so good. And then, and I like that he has like kind of a heroic ending too. You know, he beats the bishop in the face, which is kind of interesting because you're like, is this an android? Like, you don't know. Like, why would they send the actual dude down to do this? You know, it seems fucking crazy. It's like, it'd be like if, you know, like Elon Musk is famously giving Starlinks to the Ukrainian military. Like, it'd be like if he went down personally to Kyiv and like with an AK, you know, it'd be fucking crazy. You wouldn't do that.
Yeah.
But when he like hits him in the face and his ear bleeds everywhere or whatever, it shows that he's actually a person.
Or doesn't it?
Yeah, because they're all, you know, there's never been a point where the androids aren't full of milky jizz.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. If you were going to write Alien 3, where would you have taken it?
So I would have done probably the same setting. And then what I would have done is looped in a little Blade Runner action here. So my question is always like, what are the colonial marines fighting, right? What's their whole deal? So Ripley lands, and what she lands on is a planet of cybernetic insurrectionists. So like all the people there are androids, and they are like holding the planet down. So now like what the bigger stake is, like she lands in the middle of like not just people fighting, but it's like a war zone. And so you would have like androids versus colonial marines. It's sort of similar to like the William Gibson thing, except for I think that I wouldn't have muddied the like I would like have the xenomorph as like a chaos element in between. Like I think having the non-gun thing would be kind of interesting because you get to have like bishops beating the fuck out of people, you know, and so you have like this more high-powered human element versus, so you're sort of like scaling up the humans in a way by like using these cybernetic people, and maybe had a little bit of a Blade Runner crossover. That's pretty much what I would have done.
That's good. I'm hearing a little T2 in there as well.
A little bit, yeah. Just imagine like 6 Lance Henriksen's like killing like 50 colonial marines in the middle of like xenomorphs.
Yeah, great.
Yeah.
I'm on board.
Yeah, probably that. The other thing, though, I think was interesting, like the original tagline, which I think is quite good. Like they basically shot the trailer before this movie was made. It was like, on Earth, everyone can hear you scream.
Yep.
I think that's just such a cool concept, and it makes so much logical sense. Like, you want to see what happens when the thing gets there. Yeah. And I thought, like, you don't even need to unleash it on the whole planet. Like, what if they get it back into one of those like Blade Runner style mega structures, and it just gets loose in a building, and you pretty much have like Die Hard with an alien.
So like Dread.
Kind of, yeah.
Like inverted.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. And so I think you never really totally see it, but like, I think it's compelling to think that Blade Runner is kind of in the same universe. So there's like a cyberpunk element that would have happened on Earth. Sure. And I think even though you do see the alien running amok in Alien versus Predator on Earth, I think, you know, in a Sid Mead Blade Runner background with a xenomorph is compelling to me.
Yeah, I would, if I was in charge, that's where I would have gone. The 3 of them would have made it back to Earth. Don't fucking shoehorn like, oh, there was actually a face hugger on there the whole time, and Bishop noticed, but Bishop didn't alert anybody, didn't do anything about it. I think it would be much more interesting if Bishop, Newt, and Ripley made it back to Earth. Some cunning way that I haven't figured out, a xenomorph gets, or some xenomorphs get loose on Earth, and Weyland-Yutani is no longer entirely using her as a pawn, Ripley. She's actually an asset because she, in this version of the mythology, she knows more about the xenomorphs than anybody.
Yeah.
So they're depending on her to help them contain the outbreak. I think that Hicks and Newt die. It's actually useful that they're not around.
Yeah.
She is this independent hero that doesn't have to have these people around. But I think that getting rid of them in a way that serves the plot, don't serve the plot by just erasing them, serve the plot by having them killed, and that be part of her narrative. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, I just think it would be earthbound. What does that change? We get to understand Weyland-Yutani a little bit better. Not with too much information, but see what does it look like. It seems to me that what could scale it up is like the first one was just an alien on a small ship. The next one was more aliens and a squadron. Well, what if suddenly what Weyland-Yutani wanted got out of their control? Like that scales up. That is the next level up. It's not just a hive on a remote planet, but actually they're let loose, and even the great Weyland-Yutani, possibly the biggest organization in the universe, actually needs to ask Ripley for help to contain it.
Yeah. I mean, I don't even think you have to like come up with an excuse to get her, like to have the xenomorph on the ship with her. It's like now they know what to look for. Like, right. So maybe they're scanning for that shape of that ship out in the universe, and or they have like a record of a similar structure, or they're using AI to investigate the universe or something like that.
Yeah.
I don't remember anything about Covenant and Prometheus. Like, so it's possible that this happens in those movies.
Oh yeah, maybe.
definitely AI is in the air, so it feels like it makes a lot of sense that the android is a more like primary villain in those films. But I don't know. I'll have to rewatch them. I remember quite liking the way Prometheus looked. I feel like it might have been the most true to Giger's artwork version of this, but who knows? Which of these films do you think you would have survived in? Like Aliens, or Alien 3? Like, do you think you would have the best chance of getting out?
None. Maybe Aliens. Those Marines, I mean, this is totally, what is it called? Armchair quarterbacking, but they just make entirely terrible decisions the entire time. And obviously they were led by incompetence, but
yeah, that's pride, man. Hubris. Like they're too prideful. I think you would have the best chance of surviving on the prison world.
There's more space. There's only one alien. Yeah.
You could get away, because, I mean, theoretically you could get away from the thing, it's
far away.
One of the things that's weird is like in Alien 3 is it's like just murdering everybody. Like, isn't it going to need hosts?
That's something I never understood either.
Yeah. I mean, there's so many, they'll ruffle your nerd feathers with this one. There's like all kinds of weird little things, like all of a sudden she's a lieutenant, or whatever. That doesn't really bother me. Maybe she's like, it's like time in promotion, and I think I'm not totally clear on how long they're in space on the Suluco or whatever it is.
See, and that's another thing. If I was in charge of Alien 3 and it took 7 years between films, yeah, it's 7 years later. Newt, Hicks, and Riley are living innocently on Earth. They're actually kind of making a go of it, and maybe it's hard and maybe it's good, or who knows. And then it fucking revisits them. Instead of just like Ripley goes into hypersleep and then wakes up and there's still aliens. What if she had a break where she got to actually be a normal civilian for a while?
Yeah, or like a weird like Devil Wears Prada thing where it's like, well, maybe she goes up the ranks in Weyland-Yutani, and like then she's like, what happens when you're in charge of it or whatever? Well, kind of interesting.
Yep.
What if the only way to stop your weird replicant war was to unleash a bunch of xenomorphs on their fucking weird little replicant homeworld? You have to make an Ender's Game sort of choice. But I don't know. I think as once you get past like the terror of aliens, I think it stops being scary. I'd be really interested. Now I'm very interested to see Romulus, because I'm like, okay, is it going to do sort of a Texas Chainsaw Massacre thing where, like, how people see the newer Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and in some ways it's actually a better film than the first. I know this is like super blasphemous, and I would never choose the new one over the old one, but it's sort of a more effective horror movie. Like if you took somebody who hadn't seen either of them and showed them both of them today and say which one's better, and they had no nerd baggage, you'd probably pick the newer one. Like the kills are cooler and whatnot. I wonder if it's a similar thing with Romulus. I hope it's that cool.
I hope it's good. I don't have hopes very high. This has kind of been interesting that obviously I've seen Alien and Aliens many times in my life, but the rest of them I'd only seen each once and haven't seen Romulus. And so this will be interesting that we're talking about Alien 3, but I don't know what happens next because I basically forgot it.
Yeah, I don't remember.
And when we watch the next
all.
one, or when we watch Resurrection, I won't know what happens next from that either.
Another thing I was thinking about was, we only see the grungiest, shitty ships in this series. You know what I mean? Like, so no matter where you go, it's like grimdark jabronis. Right. Space trucking or wherever. Like, I think it would be interesting I wouldn't want to mix the franchises or anything like that, but a xenomorph breakout on the Star Trek. I mean, I actually was like, oh, has anybody thought about that? And immediately I thought, is like, all you have to do is go computer, isolate xenomorph genetics, teleport it off the ship, and you're pretty much fucking done. But like a more high functioning sci-fi environment. I think would be kind of like, all you'd have to do for that is like, okay, disable the teleporter, and it kind of like, now what do you do?
Right.
But I think that would be interesting.
Well, maybe Weyland-Yutani actually owns the Federation.
I mean, I'm sure they would.
There you go.
Yeah. Speaking of what they own, I haven't heard this many people anyone really talk about it, but the idea that Weyland-Yutani has so many worlds now that they can have a shitty prison world. You know, when you think about like how rare, like we've never, to this day, there's never been any planet that could support life, but now they have one that they're just going to turn into a toxic dump. Like, how dark is that?
Yeah.
Yeah, like whole wasteland planets.
This is random, but for our listeners who've listened to our Alien and Aliens episodes, you'll know that Chad has an obsession with Sigourney Weaver's pubic hair.
Mm-hmm.
And I love that in this movie, we have a lice outbreak. You're going to need to shave your head, and you can take care of the rest of you. I don't remember what the line is.
Yeah, you can take care of your privates. And then she's immediately mad. Like, which I thought about that scene too. I was like, oh, like she's just like indignant about that. I was like, oh, you just cannot get away from Sigourney Weaver's pubes in this entire franchise. I think it's delightful. Man, I wish she was in like the modern podcast long form conversation world, because I think she's like so interesting. Like, you know, like in the battle with the studio, with Fincher in the studio, she sided with him publicly, which is like not done, you know, like especially an actress. Like, I mean, actresses are so much more vulnerable than a male actors in Hollywood, you know, to have done that. In this movie, Alien 3, it's like she's peak dollar Sigourney Weaver. You know, she's done Working Girl. She's been in Ghostbusters. She's kind of like at the height of her command of what she could make. Yeah. I mean, she probably makes more now, I'm sure. But yeah, like to just be like, fuck the studio, like that just was not done back then. I mean, even Fincher like never really talked about it. You know, there's a couple interviews recently where he would say something like, the only way for there to be the director's cut is if the print of this was burned and I started over. You know, maybe that's just him being a fancy art guy. But
at the same time, I mean, just think about the worst moment of your adult life, and then imagine that millions and millions and millions of people are talking about it all the time and want you to talk about it. You're just like, no, fuck that.
Yeah, and
next question.
And the most intolerable people want to talk, you know, fucking sci-fi nerds. Yeah. Like, can you actually explain how the transmogrifier works? Like, just like that nonsense or whatever. But, you know, he went on to be David Fincher. You know, I mean, how many other people, like, they get their shot and fucking collapse and it doesn't happen. I think you have to probably be a real deal dickhead to come back, like an actual, like, hard to work with auteur to make that happen. Yeah. Like in a good way. Yeah. You know? I wonder, do you think they'll just keep making these movies, that there'll just be 10 to 15 of them? I mean, there are 10 to 15 of them if you count the Alien versus Predator.
And the video games.
Oh man, the video games. I started like peeking at the lore of the video games, and I was just like, there's some really neat ideas. Then one of the video games are these cultists who figure out a way to like keep the embryo inside them, and they have like a window on their stomach so you can kind of see the creature in, and it sort of forms a psychic bond with them, and they just walk around as like basically human versions of the jars and aliens, and they have like a sort of hive mind collective cult.
That's very silly. It's parodied in Rick and Morty, the little is that from what's that Arnold Schwarzenegger movie?
Oh, Quato.
Yeah,
it's from Total Recall.
Total Recall.
Yeah. Dan Harmon's shows loom very large in the MCU universe. Like basically like all these artists. So the MCU has a bunch of staff writers that sort of like work and sort of develop it. And they're like, you know, hey, you guys go figure out why Doctor Strange would be on this planet in between these things and what he was doing and make it connect, you know? Yeah. So there's like writers that do that sort of shit. And quite a few of them came from Community and Rick and Morty.
Oh, really?
And so there's this like whole line about how like Dan Harmon's shows are like the junior college for the MCU. Wow. Except for like, I remember watching like later MCU, especially now that it's getting all multiversal, you know, with all this like timeline shenanigans and stuff. I'm like, man, this seems very familiar. It's totally people who wrote for Rick and Morty coming into that and putting that shit into it.
Are there? Okay, I'm being a hater, and I want to be very upfront about my intolerance for.
Let the hate flow through you.
Okay, thank you. That I tend to not like franchises, and it's not as a rule. It's just that I tend to find that the more information is generally not a good thing. In TV series, that often works quite well. Mm-hmm. But I think I just don't think the way contemporary fandom works. I think contemporary fandom is actually pernicious. It's almost inherently toxic. A lot of culture in America is based around fandom. Mm-hmm. And if we've learned anything from the TV series Sherlock, it's that it's almost like fans, when taken to their natural conclusion, create toxic cesspools. I'm exaggerating, but I think that everything that perpetuates a mythology in genre fiction or genre cinema, I'm really hard pressed to see where there's an elaborate mythology that actually sustains something interesting and isn't just more stuff because people want more stuff.
Oh, I got one for you. The King James Bible, man. Like I've been thinking about.
It's so boring, dude.
Some of it.
How far into it are you? It's so boring.
I mean, I've read the whole thing before, but I would say that I forget about like some of just the weirder stuff that happens. You know, you're like, what? Like the town tried to rape a bunch of angels, and like then they burned the town down. Like just weird stuff like that. And then just there are things that just seem like I was thinking about the whole thing as if it was like a show being produced and like all the continuity and stuff like that. And there's major continuity errors. Like for example, like how does Judas die in the New Testament? In one version he hangs himself, one version he is killed by being disemboweled by a cart flipping over or something like that. And you're supposed to take it all equally serious, and they don't. It's just weird. And then there's a lot of like, it's all about references to things that happened before. So you sort of have to know about what happened to Isaiah to understand what happens in like Luke and all, and you're supposed to know all of it. And it's just fucking madness. It's like all over the place.
Well, here's, okay, to overlay my complaint, I want to articulate what I was saying, because what I was saying, if I leave it there, is not what I want to say. I don't think
you're welcome. Yeah, sorry.
I don't think communities and cultures that support specific art are inherently a problem. What I more mean is the contemporary fan, communities that believe that a TV show belongs to them and they have a say. That what an artist or group of artists do is in service to them, to the fans. That the fans are more important than the artifact, I think is, in my worldview, completely intolerable.
Yeah.
And I think that unfortunately so much art is, we were talking about art being antagonistic with capitalism in so many ways. I think art is antagonistic with fan has, I feel, two different meanings. Fan means a person who is really, really into something, but then now a fan sort of infers that there is this like online community that obsesses about something and has a certain inherent self-importance around that relationship to that K-pop band or that TV show or whatever. That's the thing I'm sort of criticizing, is that when we talk about the King James Bible and all these inconsistencies, part of what's messy about Christianity, to put it mildly, is that getting deeply invested in teasing out and explaining away and retconning all of the information in the King James Bible and believing that you are a better person and you're in dialogue with God when you do that, to me is as fucking absurd as contemporary fandom believing that Marvel should be listening to the fans. Sherlock writers should be listening to the fans. that there's some sort of self-important arrogance to just because you're obsessed about something doesn't mean your voice matters.
Yeah. So part of me totally agrees with you, but there's something like I've been thinking about similar stuff quite a bit lately. And I think the rules are totally different for mass story objects like this, like in like the Bible. I think for the Bible, part of the deal is in the interpretation and the enforcing it and the living it. And I think there's something similar happening with these massive fandoms. And I think it has something to do with scale. Like, for example, telling the director how A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night should be the sequel is fucking dumb. Like, cause it's so singular to her. You would be like, shut up, nerd, but for Superman, that means a lot to a lot of different people as a symbol and an experience that you grew up with, and maybe even an ideal for some people. Some people are super into this shit.
Sure.
I think it achieves something a little bit more mythological, and I don't want to say that you have to be careful with it, but I think that the mass demands a certain attitude towards it, like a weird sort of veneration, a weird thing. I mean, it's like the South Park thing, where they're talking about the Star Wars woman. They're like, make it a woman, make it gay, make it lame. It's like you see, like they do kind of do that stuff, like there is like, I don't care, make Thor a lady, who gives a shit, right? Like a certain way, but you also, in the same thing that allows you to just make Thor a lesbian or whatever, you have to understand you're playing in the same sandbox. And the only reason why anybody even cares enough to have let you play with that character in the first place is that there is some sort of like collective experience going on. I don't know that you have to respect it, but it's like you don't have to respect a hurricane, but it might blow your fucking house down too. And I think there's something there, and I think it might be hardwired in. I think there might be something about people that when a story gets big enough, you can't go against it. I mean, there are stories, like controversial stories, like I'm not going to mention any here because I don't want anybody mad, but you should beep this out. For example, that story is not how people remember it, and it's uncomfortable for people to learn about it, to the point where like you could like do like an 8-part serial podcast about it where you just laid it out in the most logical way possible and people still would not be able to understand it.
Absolutely.
I think there's something like that. There's just like a human brain, and a bunch of human brains connected together can't go against.
Yes.
Yeah. That story that we've just beeped out is super dark. It blew my mind. Like, like holy fuck.
It's wild.
Yeah. Subscribe to our Patreon. No, fucking way.
Someday I'm going to be really positive about something, but unfortunately, if we only stick with can we not do an Alien movie next? I know I was insisting that we do all of the Alien movies, but I would like to do something that isn't something
You need a little palate cleanser.
I do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we had a few things. I know that we have Terrell on deck for something like that from...
Yes, that'll be fun. Also, I really want to cover Dream Scenario.
Yeah, I'll have to... I mean, I want to go into it cold, so I didn't even look anything up about it. Yeah, I was like, I'm just going to eventually watch it. I thought another one that would be fun to have is Russell for Terrifier, because I remember in an old episode, I feel like Russell really does not
from Overlook Hour.
Yeah. One of my favorite people, like I think a real true fan, reminds me of all the dudes I grew up. He could be a Louisiana dude, like, and I mean that in a totally positive way. I remember him saying like he didn't think we would cover a movie like Terrifier, or I think doing the whole series would be worth doing. But it is totally my jam. I love horror comedy. Like that's my favorite shit. Like like that is clown show stuff, literally.
That movie is, or at least the first. I've only seen the first one. That is strangely better than I was expecting.
Yeah, same.
I mean, totally memorable. It is not a great movie, but totally memorable.
For some reason, like I didn't pick up on hearing about it that it's basically a comedy.
Yeah.
Or maybe like I think it's a comedy, and maybe it's not. I don't know.
It's not for a lot of people.
But yeah, it's like it's totally my jam. It's like a war concert. Yeah.
Oh, completely.
Yeah.
Maybe we shouldn't go too far down.
Is there any like
speaking about Terrifier? if we're going to cover it.
Yeah. Is there any like non-horror, like we did Facebook, for example, is there anything else like that in the world?
There's an election coming up that I want to fucking go away.
Yeah. I mean, that's not going to matter in a few weeks. Just whoever the reptiles want to appoint to win will win, and been at least entertaining this time around.
Sound and Fury.
I don't know. Like the last week or so has just been like, to me, like pure comedy. Just so much hilarious shit. And I like both candidates when they're being attacked. I think they're at their best, actually. Like, I think Kamala Harris is at her best when she's like in enemy territory. And I think all of her shit when she like goes on Howard Stern and he like licks her butthole, I think it's super fucking boring. But like when she gets like a little antagonistic, I think it's like, oh, there's like a prosecutor lady,
Right.
I mean, obviously when she was like, what happens when somebody comes in your house? She's like, I shoot him with my Glock. I'm all about it, man. I'm all in on Harris now. Not really. I'm not all in on any candidate, but you know what I mean? But nothing out there in the world. I mean, something like horrifying, but maybe not super
we get suggestions on actually Chuck Luder, thanks for the suggestion of Jacob's Ladder. I think that's definitely a good one to put in the pile for
Jacob's Ladder.
Yeah. But maybe we can put this out to our listeners if you have any suggestions on things we should cover that aren't a movie, TV show, book.
Yeah.
So what else about this movie that I really wanted to cover and then watched and regret?
Alien 3. Are we back to that? I mean, I went
any more
through,
notes?
I mean, I went through. I mean, do we want to get? There's a lot of people that say that this movie is a metaphor for abortion conversations.
Sure.
And my note here is, it's kind of funny. So for sure, obviously it's Hollywood, so they're on team kill babies, right? So I was thinking about Weyland-Yutani's Planned Parenthood. But so I was thinking about
I don't think that lines up, but okay.
No. Well, I mean, that's kind of my point here is like, obviously having this baby is going to fuck up Ripley's life in a lot of ways. And a working woman like her has no time for that. And so Bishop at the very end, or like human Bishop, he says, we have a procedure for that. It's quick. It's painless. You'll be done in a couple hours. You can still have children. It's just interesting. Like it's coming from the evil. It's like he's basically making like all the pro-abortion
She's like,
arguments.
no thanks. I'm just going to go dive in some lava.
I'd rather jump in lava than have this abortion.
Oh my God.
But she's not keeping the baby either,
I don't get it.
So it's like, it's not a victory for science, I guess. The other thing that like there's a lot of like serious talk about was, this movie came out in 1991, height of the AIDS fears. I mean, I remember being fucking terrified of AIDS at this time. And there's a lot of blood splashing on people. And there's a lot of like, a lot of the characters like gay coded sort of,
right.
Like Gallic, for example, he like when the guy who gets killed in the fan, he's like, oh, he never made fun of me. I loved him. And so there's some language like that in the film, it's a prison. So you can make your own Oz style judgments on it or whatever. I thought that was kind of an interesting read, but it's almost like a read like lost to history, right? Like in the age of prep, getting splashed with blood doesn't seem as like terrifying.
Right. Yeah. Whereas
it was like a death sentence back then.
Yeah.
It was interesting to me, like the idea, and it reminded me that like the read on something is almost like, I don't want to say like fashionable for its time, but like the read of a film will pass, and if the film is good enough, it'll be around for another, like, for example, you might talk about artificial intelligence in the film Alien. That might be a topic of conversation, but it might not have been in the past.
Right.
And then the last note I had was about how, we can like shit on how bad the xenomorph looks in this movie, but each of these movies does have a thing like that. In the first Alien, which we sort of consider a perfect film, the magazine attack is so goofy.
Yeah.
Like when he tries to kill her with, like, what is that?
By shoving a magazine in her mouth.
Yeah. And I started to understand George Lucas's like redoing the old Star Wars movies. Even though I think he made terrible choices for redoing them, it's just like, I imagine if like Ridley Scott could like John Wick that fight scene,
Right.
Like, I mean, it would probably tonally be off, but imagine he could like fit it in there in a way that made sense. And, there was something he could just approve it.
Or if Ripley attacked him first.
Something. Yeah. That would be pretty good.
I'm kidding.
That's the worst change in the Star Wars universe is like Han not shooting first. I mean,
It's the best thing about him.
it's to me, like the most foundational thing about his character. To me, it's one of the best pieces of exposition in film, like certainly in fantasy sci-fi film.
Yep.
And then I remember even before Clerks came out, like, I was like of an age of nerds that sort of like carried the torch of Star Wars through. Like we played the West End role-playing game. So if that makes sense to you, you understand what we're talking about. Mark shaking his head, which...
No idea what's happening.
So basically saying I was invested in Star Wars long past its prime and before there was ever even any like thought coming back. And I remember having like just bong rip conversations about how like Han Solo was the actual real hero of Star Wars because he wasn't born into it. He had like to make the choice. Like he had to overcome his like badness, and the shooting at the Greedo was thing. It's funny, all these years later, talking about movies, talking about dumb movies in a serious way.
You made it.
Oh man. But did we though? I mean, we never got our Comic-Con Hall E. I remember that was my goal.
Really?
When we started, I was like, if we could get on like a sub panel that nobody goes to at Comic-Con, I would be really pleased. Like if we got to like be part of a conversation about like Hatchet 6 or something, that was like the level I was going for. And we did not even achieve that.
You've let us down, listeners.
But in some ways though, we have not been let down. Our boy McDuff on Instagram, like I was talking about, man, I would really love to have Islamic Chinese food. Apparently there's a spot on Terraville in San Francisco and it's going to be great. So
we got to go.
That has made having a podcast totally worth it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Dear listeners, I'm sorry I disparaged you. You're my favorite. Is that it?
That's it.
All right.
Yep. Stay tuned for Alien 4.
Resurrection and maybe something else first.
Ugh. Alien 4. Okay.
Thanks for listening.